You bump into someone. Sorry. You ask a question in a meeting. Sorry, can I add something? You send a long message. Sorry for the essay. You ask for help. Sorry to bother you. If you start paying attention, something strange begins to appear. Many of these apologies have nothing to do with guilt. Nothing went wrong, nobody was hurt, no mistake was made. Yet the apology arrived anyway, almost automatically, almost before you had time to think, as if some part of you had already decided that taking up space required an explanation. Most people call this politeness, but there is a deeper question hiding underneath it. Why do some people apologize before they have even decided whether they have done anything wrong? And what if the word sorry has less to do with manners and more to do with safety? One of the strangest things about frequent apologizing is how invisible it becomes. People who do it rarely notice it. The word slips into conversations so naturally that it begins to sound like punctuation. Sorry for asking. Sorry for interrupting. Sorry for the reminder. Sorry for taking your time. Sorry for the late reply. Sorry for being confused. Sorry for existing in a way that might inconvenience someone for approximately 3 seconds. The habit becomes so ordinary that nobody questions it, including the person saying it. But if you slow down and listen carefully, a pattern begins to emerge. Most of these apologies happen before anyone has reacted, before criticism, before rejection, before disagreement, before conflict. The apology arrives before the threat, which raises a difficult question. If no conflict exists yet, what exactly are we protecting ourselves from? The people who apologize the most are often not the people causing the most problems. In many cases, they are the opposite. They are the considerate ones, the accommodating ones, the people who think carefully before speaking, the people who worry about hurting others, the people who replay conversations afterward wondering whether they sounded rude, the people who read their messages 3 times before sending, the people who carry an unusual amount of responsibility for how everyone around them feels, which creates a strange contradiction. The people most concerned about other people's comfort are often the people apologizing for things that don't require an apology. Why? Because the apology is doing something beyond admitting fault. It's serving another purpose. And once you see that purpose, the behavior starts making a lot more sense. Part of the reason this habit survives is because apologizing often works. It smooths interactions. It lowers tension. It communicates consideration. You're walking through a crowded street and step into someone's path. You say sorry. A small signal that says, I see you. I'm not trying to create a problem. We're okay. In situations like these, the apology makes sense. The difficulty begins when the apology expands beyond its original purpose, when it stops responding to mistakes and starts responding to possibilities. Now you're not apologizing because you've done something wrong. You're apologizing because something might be wrong, or because someone might become uncomfortable, or because someone might misunderstand you, or because conflict might appear, or because disapproval might be waiting somewhere ahead. The word sorry starts showing up in places where guilt never existed. You send a follow-up email. Sorry for checking in again. You ask a perfectly reasonable question. Sorry if this is obvious. You express a preference. Sorry, but I'd rather. You need help understanding something. Sorry, I'm confused. You remind someone about something they asked you to remind them about. Sorry to bother you. The apology starts acting like a protective layer, a cushion, a disclaimer attached to your existence. And the more often it appears, the more it reveals. Because precaution only becomes necessary when we're trying to avoid something. The question is, avoid what? Most people assume they apologize because they dislike conflict, but that explanation only goes halfway. The deeper question is why conflict feels so uncomfortable in the first place. Because not everyone reacts to disagreement the same way. For some people, disagreement is information. For others, it feels like danger. Notice how often this happens in ordinary life. A friend takes longer than usual to reply. You wonder if you upset them. A coworker seems quieter than normal. You wonder if you've done something wrong. Someone responds with fewer words than usual. You begin replaying your last interaction, searching, reviewing, looking for a mistake. A relationship feels slightly different, not worse, just different. And immediately the mind starts moving toward the same conclusion. Maybe it's me. Maybe I caused this. Maybe I should apologize. What's remarkable is how often this process begins before evidence appears, before facts, before information, before certainty. The mind reaches for responsibility first. Why? Because self-blame can sometimes feel safer than uncertainty. If the problem is me, at least the problem makes sense. If the problem is me, maybe I can fix it. If the problem is me, then maybe this situation is still under control. An apology becomes a way of restoring order, a way of reducing the discomfort of not knowing, a way of closing an open loop. And that's why so many apologies happen automatically, not because guilt arrived, because uncertainty did. The apology is often trying to solve a problem long before the problem has been identified. Which leads to a deeper question. Why does the mind move toward responsibility so quickly? Why do some people instinctively search for their own mistake whenever something feels uncertain? Because habits like these rarely appear out of nowhere. Most adaptations begin as solutions, and long before the apology became automatic, it was probably helping someone navigate a world that felt unpredictable. Imagine a child growing up in an environment where emotional tension matters, not necessarily cruelty, not necessarily anything dramatic. Sometimes something much quieter. A parent whose moods changed without warning. A household where disagreements lingered in the air. An environment where conflict felt unpredictable. A home where disappointment felt heavier than words. Children are remarkably sensitive to these things. Long before they understand emotions intellectually, they learn to recognize them. They learn faces, tones, silences, atmospheres. The subtle shift in a room when something feels wrong. And when emotional shifts become important enough, children begin adapting to them. They learn what keeps the room calm. They learn what creates tension. They learn which behaviors are rewarded, which behaviors create distance. And slowly, almost invisibly, they start adjusting themselves. Not because they're weak, because they're intelligent. Because adaptation is one of the most powerful things human beings do. A child who notices that conflict creates emotional distance may become more careful, more accommodating, more aware of everyone else's emotional state. And from the outside, these adaptations often look admirable. The child becomes easygoing, responsible, helpful, the kind of person adults praise, the kind of person who causes very few problems. But sometimes a hidden lesson forms underneath all of this. A lesson that sounds something like, keeping people comfortable is important. Then, keeping people happy is my responsibility. And eventually, if something feels wrong, it might be my job to fix it. Notice how subtle that shift is. The child doesn't just become aware of emotions, they begin feeling responsible for them. If someone is upset, they look inward. If tension appears, they look inward. If someone withdraws, they look inward. And over time, responsibility starts expanding beyond its natural boundaries. The child becomes responsible not only for their actions, but for the atmosphere, for the mood, for the comfort of the people around them. Years later, the environment may disappear completely. The person grows up, moves away, builds a different life. But the adaptation remains. Because the brain rarely asks whether a survival strategy is still necessary. It only asks whether it once worked. And if it did, it keeps using it. This is why some adults apologize before they fully understand what's happening. Someone sounds frustrated. Sorry. Someone seems distant. Sorry. The conversation becomes slightly awkward. Sorry. Not because guilt appeared, because responsibility appeared. The mind automatically begins scanning for ways to restore stability, to smooth things over, to make everything okay again. And underneath that process is a belief many people never consciously notice. The belief that harmony is safety. Because once harmony becomes associated with safety, preserving it becomes extremely important. More important than expressing a need, more important than expressing a preference, sometimes even more important than expressing the truth. And this is where the deeper pattern begins to show itself. Listen carefully to certain conversations, not dramatic ones, ordinary ones. Someone asks a perfectly reasonable question. Sorry, can I ask something? Someone shares an opinion. Sorry, but I think... Someone requests help. Sorry to bother you. Someone expresses a need. Sorry, would it be possible? The apology arrives before the request, before the opinion, before the need, before the person has even occupied the space they're apologizing for occupying. And that's what makes this pattern so revealing. Because the apology isn't responding to what happened. It's responding to what the person expects might happen. The possibility of inconvenience, the possibility of annoyance, the possibility of rejection, the possibility of being seen as too much. Somewhere along the way, a simple request became associated with risk. And eventually, the mind began trying to reduce that risk before it appeared. The apology became a form of insurance, a way of paying in advance, a way of saying, I know I'm asking for something. I know this might be inconvenient. I'm already sorry. The strange thing is that most people who do this are not demanding. They're usually the opposite. They spend more time worrying about other people's comfort than their own, more time considering other people's needs than their own, more time wondering whether they're asking too much than wondering whether they're asking enough. Which is why this pattern can be so difficult to recognize. From the outside, it looks like kindness, and sometimes it is. But sometimes it is something else entirely. Sometimes it is fear, wearing the clothes of politeness. Fear of conflict, fear of disapproval, fear of rejection, fear of becoming a burden. So they compensate, they soften, they minimize, they apologize. Not because they've done something wrong, but because they're trying to reduce the weight of their own existence. And over time, the habit becomes so automatic that it disappears into the background. The person apologizes before speaking, before asking, before disagreeing, before needing, before taking up the exact amount of space every human being is entitled to occupy. And if you listen closely enough, another sentence begins hiding underneath every unnecessary apology. Not, I did something wrong, but I hope it's okay that I'm here. And those are very different statements. One is about actions, the other is about worth. One is about behavior, the other is about belonging. This also matters because guilt and self-blame are not the same thing, and confusing them changes the way a person sees themselves. Guilt asks, what did I do? Self-blame asks, how is this my fault? Those questions sound similar, but psychologically, they're worlds apart. Guilt looks for truth. Self-blame looks for responsibility. Guilt responds to actions. Self-blame responds to uncertainty. And when someone becomes accustomed to carrying responsibility, the mind starts finding responsibility everywhere. A friend seems distant. Maybe I did something. A coworker seems irritated. Maybe I caused it. A relationship feels different. Maybe it's my fault. Silence appears. Maybe I should apologize. Again and again, responsibility arrives before evidence, because evidence requires patience. Responsibility provides immediate answers. And even painful answers can feel comforting when uncertainty feels unbearable. At least an answer gives the mind somewhere to stand. And that is where many automatic apologies truly begin. Not in politeness, not in manners, not even in guilt, but in the deep human desire to restore certainty, to restore harmony, to restore safety. Even if that means accepting responsibility for things that were never yours to carry. That's why telling someone to simply stop apologizing often misses the point entirely. Because the apology is rarely the real issue. The apology is the symptom, the visible surface of something deeper, a learned strategy, a protective reflex, an adaptation. And adaptations don't disappear just because someone notices them. They persist because they once solved a problem. Every habit survives because at some point it helped. At some point, apologizing quickly may have reduced tension, prevented conflict, maintained connection, protected a relationship, protected a sense of safety. The habit wasn't irrational. It was effective. The challenge is that what protects us in one environment can quietly limit us in another. A strategy designed for survival can continue operating long after survival is no longer at stake. And that's often what we're seeing when someone apologizes for things that require no apology. We're seeing an old solution being applied to a new situation, a strategy that never received the message that the environment changed. So why do we apologize so quickly? Not because we're polite, although politeness may be part of it. Not because we're guilty, although guilt sometimes plays a role. Not because we're weak. The answer is something quieter than any of those. Many quick apologies are attempts to prevent discomfort before it arrives, to prevent conflict before it begins, to secure acceptance before acceptance feels uncertain, to preserve harmony before harmony is threatened. The apology arrives first because the mind is trying to keep the world predictable, relationships stable, people close, itself safe. Two people can say the exact same word for completely different reasons. One person apologizes because they made a mistake. Another apologizes because they're afraid of making one. One apologizes because harm occurred. Another apologizes because harm might occur. And that difference changes everything, because it reveals that many apologies are not admissions, they're anticipations. Not reflections of guilt, reflections of fear. Not statements about what happened, statements about what the mind believes could happen. And perhaps the most important part of all this is that the people who apologize the most are often the people trying hardest to make life easier for everyone around them. The people carrying the most responsibility, the people paying the closest attention, the people most determined to preserve connection. Which means frequent apologizing often reveals something much deeper than guilt. It reveals what a person learned they needed to do in order to feel safe, what they learned they needed to do in order to stay accepted, what they learned they needed to do in order to belong. And once you understand that, the behavior looks very different. Not like weakness, not like insecurity, not like a flaw. but like an adaptation, a human response to a human experience, a strategy created by a mind that was trying to navigate relationships, uncertainty, and connection as best it could. So the next time you hear someone apologize for asking a question, or apologize for taking a moment of your time, or apologize before they've even finished their sentence, listen carefully. Because the most important thing they're communicating may not be the apology itself. It may be the story underneath it. The story that taught them conflict was expensive, that needs were risky, that taking up space required permission. And maybe that's the hidden truth behind all of this. Maybe people who apologize too quickly are not always saying, "I did something wrong." Maybe, in ways they don't even realize, they're asking a much older question. A quieter question. A question that has nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with belonging. A question that sounds like this: is it okay for me to be here? And sometimes, the quickest apologies don't come from people who believe they've made a mistake. They come from people who learned long ago to make themselves smaller, before the world had the chance to ask them to. That is why we apologize so quickly, not because we are guilty, but because somewhere along the way, caution learned to speak in the language of guilt. And the word sorry, which was meant to repair something broken, became instead the sound of someone trying to hold things together before anything had the chance to fall apart. If this video helped put something into words you felt but never fully understood, consider subscribing to Unsaid. And if this idea resonated with you, leave a comment below. Sometimes the experiences we think are most personal turn out to be the ones we share with the most people.